1990s Nickelodeon. Whenever I think about those shows, I have to be honest, I do tend to get nostalgic. Or at least I used to. Because see, in my case, I am a 90s kid. But that means that I was born in the early 90s. So most of the shows that Nickelodeon was dropping, I mean, yeah, I kind of remember it, but it's a distant memory. Like, I'm very young. You know, when you're 5, 6, 7 years old, you're not really paying attention to what you're seeing. And Paramount Plus, which has been pushing their streaming platform, they gave a $2.99 deal, so I was like, all right, I'll drop in. And when I dropped in, I started rewatching some of these shows. I mean, not just from the 90s, but even the 2000s. And what it reminded me that I had no idea what I was actually watching. Now, at this time in my life, I am in my 30s. I have children. And I think critically about what they are actually watching. Like, what is the message behind the show? Television is written by adults. These are screenplays. Like, real adults, not children, come up with these shows. And Nickelodeon really took off in the 90s. I think that's safe to say. All the evidence, if you're talking about, you know, even Nickelodeon Studios, Universal Studios, you know, in Orlando, Florida, like the way they put their base there. I mean, all the shows that we remember, you know, your Kenan and Kel's, Rugrats, yeah, all of that is 90s Nickelodeon. So what I'm going to get into in this video, because I think you deserve to know the truth, is as I've been studying up on these shows and watching the journey, like seeing how this all played out. Remember when I said we didn't really know what we were watching? Well, we were missing a whole lot. There are so many hidden messages. I mean, I guess not so hidden messages because they were kind of out in the open. We were kids, so we didn't notice. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say this part. Our parents did not know what we were watching either. That's why they let us see it. Now, full disclosure, as I go through this video, I'm going to do this from the only perspective that I know how. I am a man who is a Christian. That is my faith. So when I look back at these shows and, you know, figure out, you know, what was actually happening, that is the lens by which I'm going to view it. But you deserve to know the truth. But I can't get into 1990s Nickelodeon between 2000 and 2010 and breaking down the top 10 to 15 shows, because that's what I'm going to do. The ones that were the most watched. Like, if it wasn't in that most watched category, at least compared to like what IMDb had to tell us, I ain't gonna focus on it. No shade, just being honest. But you can't really understand 1990s Nickelodeon if you don't know exactly what happened before it. Now, some of this is info I got from the documentary The Orange Years, so you know you can look it up if you want to. Long story short, if you go back to the 80s, Nickelodeon had a show that ran for about a decade. The name of the show, because I don't remember this because I'm born in the 90s. The show was called You Can't Do That on Television. I don't know a whole lot about the show. But what it was doing was they were trying to push the envelope in what you could do in children's media. The reason they wanted to do it is because they did focus groups. And again, this is what the Orange Years is telling us. They wanted to make TV that the kids wanted to watch. But to clarify, they were also pushing back on television that was, I guess what you would call what your parents wanted you to watch. In other words, shows that actually had, you know, values and morals and things that aligned with what parents wanted to see their kids grow up and move towards. Just give the kid what they want. Now, because I'm a parent of young children, if I ask my sons, what do you want to eat for dinner? They're probably going to respond back with pizza. Or worse, they'll say, we want cake. So if you just give them what they want, that's what we're going to end up on. And yeah, we could give you cake and give it to you again. But long term, how's this going to play out for us? But Nickelodeon figured out that kids want cake, kids want cookies, and they might even accept pizza. And that's what they fed them over and over again. So when you come out of the 80s, you know, you can't do that on television. Remember, I ain't really watch it, but that's the name of it. You can dig into it for yourself if you want. That brings us to the year 1990, where Nickelodeon did something wild. The first show that they really kicked off hard on was a show called Are You Afraid of the Dark? I'm not making this up. When they came up with the idea, the focus groups they did told them that children want to watch, you know, or children like horror shows or really like scary stories, all of that, like around the campfire. That was the concept. And they knew that this is what the focus groups told them the kids liked. But they also knew that parents really weren't down with the idea of a TV show that's goal was to scare their children. Again, I'm not making this up. This is what the adults said themselves. So they go out and make the show, and they come up with all these different, you know, parameters to try to, you know, make it educational while it's still a horror show. Because that's what it is. They didn't get a lot of backlash from parents. And that was basically what it taught Nickelodeon. What it taught the execs was, like I said before, parents really don't know what their children are watching. I mean, they took, you know, some, you know, stories that came from novels and so on. Some of them might have came from short stories and kind of, you know, blew them up and kind of put them in the shows to make it educational. But fundamentally, it's a horror show for children designed to scare the kids. That's all they're trying to do. So, again, somebody like me, growing up in a Christian home, that is obviously not something my parents co-signed. Now, I didn't watch Are You Afraid of the Dark? Like, I just didn't watch that show. But it opened the doorway because I'm going to get into the next show, but you got to understand that if you remember the words SNICK, SNICK, because I remember SNICK, like I remember even watching it a little bit. Remember, I'm a 90s kid. SNICK, which ran all the way through to 2005, but it dropped in 1992. So I'm skipping ahead a little bit. And when SNICK drops, it's basically, to me, Are You Afraid of the Dark? Like the concept that they took away from it, like the parents don't know what we're watching, that's what launches SNICK. Because SNICK was basically for kids who, again, this is what the exec said, they were aiming for children who were too young to go out and party on a Saturday, but they were too old to go to sleep early. And the parents were basically going to be off doing something, so the kid is just sitting with the TV. So you just put on programs that the kid wants to watch. Again, give the kid candy, give the kid cake, you might even give him a little bit of pizza. But we ain't going to give him anything that's good for him. See where I'm going with this? But if you're new here, I want to say thank you for even making it this far into the video. I'm Ezra2K. If you really want to know the hidden messages behind nostalgic TV, then you are in the right place. And if anything that I say actually connects with you, it is always greatly appreciated if you would please like and subscribe. But if I don't, just let me know in the comment section, because I try to read them all. So if we're just following the timeline, the next show that I got to give you is Clarissa Explains It All. Now, that's another show that I watched a little bit. When I say a little bit, I mean a little bit. But it had a female lead, which is not something that we really got a whole lot of in television at that moment. You go back to shows like The Wonder Years and so on, like you have boys in the center. And then you also have shows like Full House, which that drops in like 1987. But you have adults, specifically, male adults, if you're not counting Aunt Becky later on in the seasons, like you had Full House as a family show. Like we were in a window of TV heading into the 90s where family TV was normal. But remember, Nickelodeon figured out the parents don't know what the kids are watching. And that's how they're aiming the shows. So Clarissa Explains It All runs for several seasons. It's pretty successful. It's celebrated for having a female lead. She has her crushes and, everything going on in the school and drama. She has her friends, yeah, that's all fine. But what you kind of have to focus on is Clarissa Explains It All is groundbreaking, one, because of the female lead. But the other thing is it pushes the needle a little bit on neutralizing parents. Because the actor who plays the father in Clarissa Explains It All, he's on record. And when he's on record, what he's saying is he was frustrated for a while that he didn't really get to kind of really act. Like he's in the show, but he's a prop for Clarissa's life. This is not even like Boy Meets World, which drops in like 1993 or anything like that. Obviously not Full House from 87. This is not that, where the parents are like actually parenting through the show, providing real guidance. You are just kind of there. It's Clarissa Explains It All. You see what I'm saying? It's all about her. Nobody else. Like she is in the center. She don't need parents to help her out with this. And that's a running theme with Nickelodeon. Like, trust me. I'm likely going to do a follow-up that goes into the 2000s, and I might even dig into specific shows and different videos on this channel. We'll find out. But this whole neutralizing parents was a precursor to eventually dumbing them down and then killing them off. But we ain't ready for that yet. Because in 1991, something else happened. On the cartoon side, you got two shows. You got Rugrats and you got Duck. Now, I'm going to focus on Rugrats first. It's the one that I watched the most. It ran from like 91 or so all the way up to like 2003 as far as like dropping new episodes. Doug dropped at the same time, but only ran like at least on Nickelodeon because Disney eventually bought the rights to it and used the IP. But 91 to 94-ish is when they were putting new episodes out. So we'll explain, or I'll try to break down why both kind of went two different directions. Rugrats, which I watched a whole lot. I used to think that show slaps. And I'm not saying it's bad, but fundamentally what they were trying to give kids is, again, look at the messaging. Like how they're moving the needle on certain things. Where now you have this world that revolves around talking baby. Yeah, you could do it. You could do talking babies on a TV show if you want to. But the babies have this elaborate life. That's how I describe it. It's really an elaborate private life that's separate from the adults, including Angelica, because Angelica can talk to the adults and she can converse with the babies. Don't really know how that works, but it is what it is. And all the different crazy plots that are playing out, a lot of it is imagination, they're playing with a box and the box turns into a race car or whatever. Like season 1, I think on the way to season 2, season 3, as Rugrats kind of found its footing, really kind of goes off the deep end. But just look around you at even some of the adult humor in the show. You have the doctor, they call Dr. Lipschitz. Think about that name for a moment. And this is the person who's giving advice to the parents on how to, raise their baby. And I think there was a whole plot line going off memory here where, he didn't have any kids. Come on, man. The parents are pretty... they're very out of touch because their babies just be off. They be in a whole different yard or off, like a dog is trying to chase them and maybe Spike got to come save them. The whole point is the parents are so out of touch that these babies are essentially raising themselves, figuring out what is this, what is that, you know what I mean, like running all over. Yes, Tommy is the leader. Yes, Chucky is, the scaredy cat. I mean, Phil and Lil, they just be getting into foolishness, all type of recklessness. I mean, all the babies got into the little hijinks and stuff. And then you have Angelica terrorizing them. But the key is they create an elaborate world for children. And see, I'm a kid watching this, and it makes me think that as a child, like, it kind of moves the needle on what I would call an elaborate private life. This idea that there's a break between you and your parents, what they should know about how your life functions and what you're actually on. Like, we ain't got to tell them everything. Because these babies was not telling them everything. But part of it, because for the purpose of the plot, they couldn't. But it is what it is. I think the talking babies stick, that's what I'm going to call it, the shtick, that's really what hit. I mean, because Rugrats, they did movies, Rugrats in Paris, Chucky gets, his father marries, somebody else, and then he gets a sister, a stepsister, Kimmy, and like, yeah, all that happened. But then you got Doug on the other end, because they both launched at the same time. And Doug just didn't hit anywhere near as hard. It's still a cartoon, but Doug is older. I guess he's like middle high school aged. He has 2 parents in the home. But remember, we've already established that Nickelodeon ain't focusing on parents. So in this case, the parents are neutralized. That's what I call it. They're not even neutralized. I'd say they're like faded all the way to the back. Like, they're there, but they ain't there. It's easier to do with cartoons and with live action. That's why you got quotes from the man who played the father in Clarissa Explains It All, who was tight about the whole situation. But regardless, Doug was considered like a gentler show. And as a result, the theory is that Doug didn't stick because the rest of what Nickelodeon was doing in this window going forward, especially like 93, 94, when Doug kind of flamed out, was way more aggressive in the cartoon space. Like, I'm about to get to that part in a moment. But like, hey, I remember Quail Man. I remember Pork Chop. I remember all that stuff. Now, I didn't really watch Ren and Stimpy. It might have been on, but for the most part, I flipped to another channel. I was very young. But I do remember that it was on. Now, as an adult, looking back, Ren and Stimpy apparently dealt with, some clashes. I mean, like, because again, it dropped in 91. But as far as like public, reception, there were some clashes because it had adult humor, it had dark humor, it had violence. Like, this is what the show had. The characters Ren and Stimpy are technically a dog and a cat. But again, it's, similar to CatDog, which I'm going to get to later. Like, obviously it's a cartoon. You can kind of run all the way off the deep end with this. I mean, aside from all the adult humor and dark humor and all that, it had a lot of shock value. I mean, we already addressed violence. So, like, these are the types of things that the show was known for. So when you got Doug next to Ren and Stimpy, what do you think the kid is going to watch if you give him a choice? The one that's the gentler approach? Yeah, you got neutralized parents, and Doug got some stuff going on. But Ren and Stimpy it's wild. We've never seen anything like that before. Remember, keep the same energy from a show called You Can't Do That on Television. That's what Ren and Stimpy is doing. When it comes to cartoons on Nickelodeon, obviously you can get wild because with art direction, you can kind of, take things all the way off the deep end. Apparently there was even, production issues for Ren and Stimpy where I think like 1992, it's like a year into its run, standards and practices for Nickelodeon were not being upheld. So they kind of had to outsource the production of the show. So it goes to another network or like another house who's kind of producing it. So there's like a drop in quality, whatever that means. So Ren and Stimpy wasn't even Ren and Stimpy in its, truest form from that point on down. But ironically, the show still ran till 1996. And I gotta throw something else in there because in between, in 1993, you also had Rocko's Modern Life. I'm not gonna waste a whole bunch of time on Rocko. I mean, apparently he's a wallaby and, he moves to America and he has his world that he's kind of, living in. Again, it's a cartoon, wildly off the deep end. But a lot of the same stuff people said about Ren and Stimpy is exactly what they said about Rocko's Modern Life. Adult humor, shock value, like that's what it was known for. I mean, like I said, I ain't gonna waste my time on it. That's just what it was. Remember, this is a kid's show. It's on Nickelodeon, shock to children. Remember, I'm a 90s kid. I have access to watch this at 6, 7 years old. By that point, it's in reruns. Rocko's Modern Life turns off by 1996. Like, same year that Ren and Stimpy goes off, Rocko's Modern Life goes off. And you can kind of tell that there's going to be a changing of the guard in terms of the TV shows once we kind of keep moving. But in between there, like I said, I ain't going to waste much time there. Then you go to 1993, because, Rocko started in 1993. In that same time, you had Legends of the Hidden Temple. Now, Nickelodeon had a whole bunch of game shows that they tried to do. It's called Legends of the Hidden Temple. Now, the Legends part, that's one thing, like crazy tales and stories. But then when you get to Temple, what is a temple? A temple is a place of worship. So y'all got like a show about a temple, which is a place of worship. So the real question is, what are we worshiping? Now, Olmec was like this big head figure. almost like Zordon, but not. If you think of Power Rangers, I'll probably get into that some other time, but definitely not today. So when you get to, Olmec, who is, the guy who knows all the temple legends and stories and, the big talking head, they had somebody narrating it. I don't know how much he got paid for that job. The whole point being, it's a place of worship and they're competing in this temple. And then think about it. You fast forward, because the game always ended with a temple run, where the kids, the little, boy-girl teams, I believe it's always boy-girl teams, they eliminate each other out, and then they get to the final where you go into the temple to, run through and try to, with your pendant and try to, make all the different things. I think like the shrines and all that kind of stuff. But like, see the words, see the choices, see the imagery, because they're pushing back on something. Because when you have a temple, which is a place of worship, who are we worshiping? Because they ain't worshiping the God of the Bible. That's clear. Now, are they worshiping Olmec up in the air, kind of up for debate? But okay, I'll give an example. When you get to the temple run, which is likely where the game came from, like, the cell phone game Temple Run, like the end of Legend of the Hidden Temple, that final like boss level that the kids would go to is called the Temple Run. And when they would go in there, jump through all these rooms, one of the rooms was called the Shrine of the Silver Monkey. Let that sink in. The Shrine of the Silver Monkey. Once again, a shrine is a place where you worship something. So in this case, they're saying in that shrine, you are worshiping the Silver Monkey. Now, it's playful. You ain't got to take it that deep. I watched the show. That's not my point. But you see how they're chipping away. Like with the imagery of these shows, you're slowly chipping away at, like there's a spiritual underpinning or a spiritual undertone that takes you away from, certain ideas, certain values around, family and God and, what's right and what's wrong. Like, it's slowly being pushed. You're getting used to or accustomed, some would even say desensitized, to this language. Again, temple, shrine, unnecessary. Remember, Nickelodeon had a show called Guts is not on this list. But I remember watching Guts. It was almost like an extreme sports show for kids. A lot of bungee cords and stuff. Like they, maybe have like a basketball, have to jump down, the bungee cord, go up real high, maybe like 12 feet and dunk the basketball. Like crazy stuff like that. Like it was fun. And they had the aggro crag. But the thing is, Guts did not have like the spiritual component. There was no temple. There were no shrines. There were no shrines to a monkey. There was no Olmec talking to you. None of that happened. Like this is what I'm really, kind of picking up on. Because remember, I'm watching these shows as a child. I remember I was just talking to my mom the other day. Remember, I'm a grown adult in my 30s with children. And I'm talking to her about some of these things that I saw on TV. And she's like, you didn't watch that? I'm like, yes, I did. And she's like, where was I? I was like, probably cooking dinner or something. The parents didn't know what their kids were watching. This is what's on, Nickelodeon, which is a kids program or kids network. So for the most part, if it says it's for kids, probably all right. At least that's the assumption. And now that I've made it all the way through all of that, see where I'm going with this. Time to address the elephant in the room. Because all that, which technically launched in 1994, was, I guess you could argue, probably one of the most iconic shows that Nickelodeon launched. Now, it's a sketch comedy show for children. All that is a big deal for several reasons, because without all that, in theory, you don't get Kenan and Kel, you likely don't get Drake and Josh, you don't get what eventually becomes, the Amanda Show. If you don't get Drake and Josh, then we likely don't get Miranda Cosgrove, which eventually becomes, what's the show she dropped? iCarly. Like, essentially Nickelodeon, like you could say that it's like all that is almost like the center of the universe for a lot of the live action that kind of spearheads out. I'll drop in or probably talk about a lot of other things. And in this video, I'm probably going to end here. But all that is a big deal. Now, 94 till into the 2000s when it runs, did like a first show run. And then it kind of relaunched and it kept on going. I think 2005, I'm going off head here. I think that's when it like technically stopped. But all that, I think, with when you think SNICK, I think all that is like prime and center. They used to always have special guests, for music, who would, come in and sing. So, again, they're normally doing some taping in front of live studio audiences. So there's that piece, but I think that's what the live musical guests were for. But we get to kind of get a little look in on the TV episode. But at the end of the first elephant in the room with all of that is everything that went on with the documentary Quiet on Set and, the allegations and things that, have come out about how some of the actors were treated. I guess Dan Schneider related. Some of that was, beyond that, like a general, what they call toxic work culture. So all of that is incredibly sad and very disappointing to hear, because as kids, we're watching this and we don't understand any of what's going on in the background for obvious reasons. But I think if you just focus on the on-screen part, as a sketch comedy, all that 100% was all about pushing the envelope, all about it. That's all they did. Whatever you can't do on television, they did it, at least to the end by which they thought that they could get away with it. I mean, yes, I remember Good Burger, welcome to Good Burger, home of the Good Burger, can't take your order. Like, yeah, it was funny. It was. And we celebrate, the comedy of it. But here's the thing about child actors. And so without getting into the details about, who was on the shows, whether it was Lori Beth Denberg, Danny Tamborelli, obviously the bigger name actors, the people you recognize, your Kenan and Kels, and, your, Drake, your Josh, Drake Bell, like, yeah, all of that. Like, again, Amanda Bynes got her start there really, like, as far as, like, getting taken seriously on Nickelodeon. But if we leave the individuals out and just focus on, like, the narrative for a moment, when I consider all that, I feel like it kind of opened up Pandora's box. Because once they proved that they could essentially go wherever they wanted to and push the kids into some very uncomfortable positions, I think that's what we're kind of getting from Quiet on Set in a different way. Like, on the most basic level, the actors are being told by the adults who are writing things to portray things for comedy. And again, they're trying to give what they think kids want. But it's at the expense of the actor. Like, again, are you reflecting reality or are you dictating reality? I think that's the question when it comes to all that. With all of the craziness, if you really think, like, you don't got to ask me. If you go looking up all that sketch comedy scenes, specifically, whether it's from the 90s or what have you, you're going to see some pretty wild stuff. It's just not in the realm of reality. Forget about parents. Like that, like the parental influence, because where would children actually be if they didn't have good parents? Nobody actually believes, based on any data, that having good parents, like who are, especially two good parents in a non-conflict marriage, that they call a low-conflict marriage with two parents, your two biological parents, like that, like in theory, like, yes, there's a lot of different family structures that exist, but forget parents. That's like totally out when you get to a sketch comedy show of this nature. You can just kind of create a bunch of little pockets of randomness. And when you are a child actor, I think this is very relevant to all that, because child actors are very different from adult actors. They're in the regard that, yes, they audition and they have to get hired for jobs and all that is similar to the adults. But for the most part, you only cast a child actor for whom you think there's something in that kid that reflects the character you want them to portray. They're not like method actors that like become something new. They more or less try to keep you in the pocket. It's the reason why once you have a character that sticks in a sketch comedy show, if you think you can build a whole show around it, you just keep running with it. Like Kenan and Kel, let's take them for a moment. They played Kenan and Kel, the guys we laughed at every time we saw them. Now, they got paid for it. That's not the point. Whether it was the different sketches that we saw, repairman, man. Like, they were always the ones being laughed at. Now, we can celebrate that they were, I guess, trailblazers in terms of, young black men in comedy. And, like, that can be celebrated for what it is in theory. But, again, just using them. There's so many other actors and components to it. All that, to me, was the bomb that went off in the 90s. Once that bomb went off, again, Nickelodeon already had figured out with Are You Afraid of the Dark that they could get away with a whole lot. And they knew they could because the parents weren't really paying attention. That's how they launched SNICK, because it was a whole block for kids for whom they basically assumed the parents are not paying attention. But then you get to all that, which takes that and runs with it, because they could basically just demo a bunch of craziness and see where it would go. And when they found out that it got ratings, that it hit, then they could once that bomb detonated, they could just keep on running in whatever direction they wanted. And that's exactly what happened in the back half of the 90s. So I already addressed all of that. And I'm not going to say everything I went over there, but all that was a bomb that went off in the 90s that basically set us down a course for the remainder of Nickelodeon's tenure. This was all that. This is what it was. And we watched it. We found it entertaining. But remember, the cable era was something different. Kids did not really have the same amount of choices they do now. For that matter, parents didn't. Either you were going to watch Nickelodeon, to some degree later on, you were either going to watch Disney Channel or Cartoon Network, and that's about it, at least when it comes to kids' television in the middle of the day. So when all that shows up, again, it draws the ratings because of the shock value. And once that bomb goes off, that is it. Nickelodeon now knows the future of the channel is set, because if this works, what else is going to work? But while all that was starting to take off, in 1996, Hey Arnold was released on Nickelodeon. Not going to waste your time with this. Everybody knows Arnold is the main character, the football head. His best friend is Gerald. Helga Pataki has, a crush on him, but she doesn't tell him. It's kind of like a running joke for the entire show. She's like, pining away in her, love shrine. Again, we bring up, the concept of shrines. It's almost like worship, which is very problematic in and of itself, but it is what it is. But Arnold himself, and they get into it later on in the concept of the plot, but he doesn't have parents. Now, a lot of the characters around him technically do, but Arnold does not have parents, or at least they're not present. He is living with his grandparents. He is a 4th grader. He's 9 years old, and he's living in a city that is in some way resemblant of New York City. Maybe not exactly, but resembles it, because he takes public transit, buses, and trains, and he's more or less just kind of living his life at 9 years old with a whole lot of freedom. To the point where I remember being a child, and I'm starting to think, how come I don't have the freedom to take the public bus or take the train or go here and like get into all this? Like, because he's really out here. Most of the plots only work just on the pretense that he is out and about without any parental guidance, which is a running theme that Nickelodeon continued to push. The idea of either neutralizing parents, figuring out a way to remove them entirely, or misrepresenting them. If you think about the other characters who have parents in the show, I mean, Gerald seemingly had a decent family at home between his parents, like the father and the mother. But then you go to Helga Pataki. Her parents are problematic. We have a father who's more concerned about his work than anything else. You have one daughter who's seemingly perfect, and that ain't Helga. I mean, he's pretty clearly playing favorites. You have a mother who's like checked out in the marriage. She's more or less like the joke. Like if you're an adult watching it, it's pretty clear that she's like some form of a functioning alcoholic. But they can't say that because it's a kid's show. Like this is what we're watching. And remember, anytime you have children who are watching representations like this, it's one thing if the parents are in the room. Nickelodeon is getting away with this under the pretense that the parents aren't really paying attention. But when it comes to any dark humor, any sexual innuendo, things like that play into the cartoon, which Hey Arnold maybe wasn't the most chronic with this. When we get to the back half of the 90s, there is one show in particular that you cannot ignore. But Arnold even lived in a boarding house, so even that part was a little weird to me, where he's exposed to all these other adults who live in this framework, so it's not like a traditional family home. And there are plot lines that run off with these people, in a bunch of different directions. I mean, there are moments where you see some cross-dressing. Like there's a character, Mr. Wynn. There's the episode where, there's a Romeo and Juliet scene, and he's really pressed to play Juliet. Again, this is an image that kids are receiving, even if it's in a cartoon. But to be real with you, as big as Hey Arnold might be, the year 1996 is still much more about Kenan and Kel. Now, when I say those names, most people will remember the song. Oh, here it goes, and I'm one of them. Because I did watch Kenan and Kel while it was on. Like, in the 90s, I am watching it live. But at that time, I'm like 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. Let's clarify. I'm young. Kenan and Kel, this is how I understand it. For the most part, we don't really see Kel's parents. They're really just not reflected in the plot. Kenan and Kel are always presented like as the acting tandem, as a comedy duo. And I'm not here to say they aren't funny. There's a lot of slapstick humor, which I guess is fine enough. But the plots of the shows and then the structure of it, because Kenan comes from a family that is a typical family, the 2.5 kids, in this case it's 2, him and a younger sister. But this is the moment in television where, as far as I'm concerned, Nickelodeon decided they were going to turn the parents into buffoons. It's not the last time, but it's probably the most pronounced. Kenan and Kel, because Kel, we don't really see his parents. Kenan's parents are there, but they're not providing any guidance at all. They're incredibly out of touch, offer very little value. There are moments when they just have to be clueless in the situation in order for things to kind of play out the way that they do. I mean, yes, it's comedy. I totally get that. But the message is now being sent that parents are out of touch. They are irrelevant. You don't need them. You might even know more than they do. But here's the catch. It's a comedy because Kenan and Kel just get into a whole bunch of wild hijinks. And even that's putting it mildly. The plot structure, go back and watch a Kenan and Kel episode. The plot ends up in so many random places. Like, offhead, I remember Kenan ending up in a donut shop, him and Kel, that he's trying to do something with a donut or make a special donut. Somehow something goes wrong with the donut machine. They end up creating this super large donut and getting stuck in it. How that happens, hard to explain. But Drake and Josh, which I'll get to in another video, did some version of this with sushi. That I do remember. But even another thing, I remember there was something where Kenan has, a crush on the daughter of his father's work boss. And here's the thing, we see his father, talking very inappropriately, maybe not cursing per se, but just making a lot of wild, outlandish statements about his boss. He ends up on record, somehow Kenan records a voice note. Like this is, like a voice recording. This is back when people still had landlines. And it gets sent over to the boss because he was trying to call the girl to ask her out on a date. So he ends up breaking into the boss's house. You see what I'm saying? They're breaking and entering. And it wasn't like it was an accident in any small form. Like he tried to get in that house. And it was all about getting in there to, erase the message. Eventually, the family comes back. Again, there's a whole bunch of crazy things that go down. But if you understand, again, breaking and entering, you have the misrepresentation of the father in this episode with his language, which is setting a terrible example for the children. At least he's present in this episode doing something, because there's somewhere he's more or less a ghost. Generally speaking, Kenan and Kel, if you really watch it, remember, consider watching this as a child without parental guidance. That is the important part. What are you really consuming? And what are you going to take away? Because kids don't know what to focus on. Don't give us that much credit. When I'm 6 and 7 years old, I'm finding it all entertaining for what it is. But I don't know what to talk about. And the needle is once again being pushed. And because of what they did with the parents in Kenan and Kel, it makes the 2000s era, when I finally get there, it clarifies a whole lot of things. Because parents go from being neutralized to being made into idiots to eventually just getting rid of them in the show entirely. We don't need parents anymore. Kids can raise themselves. They'll be fine. And after Kenan and Kel, I do have to admit that Nickelodeon really coasted through the remainder of the 90s, for the most part, on Nicktoons. Again, that's the phrase that they coined, and I remember it, so I'm just going to call them Nicktoons instead of just cartoons for the purpose of argument. The Angry Beavers dropped in 1997, and I do remember that moment. I do remember watching it. I think their names were, Daggett and Norbert. Why they chose those names, I'm pretty sure there's some reason that goes beyond me. And the show's premise, interestingly enough, because this is aimed towards kids, you have these two beavers who are brothers who are trying to live a bachelor lifestyle. Again, bachelor lifestyle. When you are a child, you're talking about being an adult living as a bachelor or whatever that means. You see how that's a very detached narrative from someone like myself if I'm just thinking about the average kid 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But hey, this is what they chose to put out there. There's a whole bunch we could say about the Angry Beavers, because if you actually watch it, you'll see that there's still a lot of that same energy. If you remember Ren and Stimpy or Rocko's Modern Life, which I covered in part 1, both of those have adult humor, adult situations to some degree, sexual innuendo, dark humor, satire, violence, all of that is showing up. And the Angry Beavers is not a whole lot different from that. That's still in there. And if you understand the history of that show specifically, I guess just bullet point note, censorship was actually a pretty big part of the experience for the writers. Because there's what they wanted to do, and then there's what the Nickelodeon executives let them do. Just let that sink in for a moment. Because with everything I've covered already in this video, but specifically in the first part, from, a network that started off in the 80s based around a show called You Can't Do That on Television. There was a Nickelodeon executive who more or less held the writers at bay because they felt like their creativity was being stifled by this executive. There was actual discussion about, are they going to do some form of cross-dressing with the characters? Again, they're cartoon beavers, but still. And the executive said, no, we're not doing that. And they kind of felt frustrated that was shut down. Obviously, if you're someone coming from a Christian context like myself, exposing children to those types of images is problematic. But more importantly, the executive felt the same way. He's like, hey, let's not confuse the little children. That is what he's on record saying. Don't confuse the kids. The censorship even extended to things like just the use of the word shut up and so on and so forth in the way the characters interacted. I don't know anybody who had it on their top rung, and the show didn't really run that long either. It ran for a few years, but nothing compared to some of the other heavy hitters that Nickelodeon came up with in the 90s. So, the Angry Beavers, yeah, that happened. But in 1998, they had another cartoon where, depending on how you look at it, maybe they got it right. Because CatDog drops in 1998, and that thing runs for almost 5, 6, 7 years. It runs well into the 2000s. CatDog. Most people just remember the dog and the cat that are appendaged together, which, if you're an adult who's looking at it, you can already process, how does this work anatomically? It may be a cartoon, but basic biology does apply here. And that's seemingly non-existent. So that was actually one of the controversies around the show. Just the baseline of the dog and the cat being pasted together. But on a deeper level, CatDog does have a lot of Ren and Stimpy energy. I keep progressing back to that because those are the shows that came in the early 90s with adult humor, satire, violence, dark humor, all of these things that were sexual innuendo. CatDog puts a lot of that same energy out there. Again, it runs longer. I think the cat and the dog together is just way more memorable from a cartoon perspective. And yeah, the comedy, it's there and it's tended to be funny. But here's the thing about CatDog. CatDog stands out. And it stands out for a very specific reason. Because there were scenes from the show that were considered to be very disturbing, specifically for adults, not even just for the kids. Remember, the kids aren't going to go picketing about it because they don't know what to focus on. They're just accepting this, like, as entertainment. And because it's on, it must be all right. Again, it's aimed for the kids. But, okay, one of the scenes that seemingly was real problematic was where, dog was eating, the dog part of the cat dog was eating trash. And while he's eating a bunch of garbage, it makes him sick in such a way where, it messes up the cat and, his teeth fall out. And they're like a flesh-eating monster that, gets involved and, comes for the cat. Like, these images were considered disturbing by the adults who would watch the show if they were in the room with their children. CatDog, are you starting to see the issue? I'm not here to attack for every show from my childhood and perhaps even yours and call it bad. But I like to think of this, and I'll probably go back to this a little bit later, as some version of a death by 1,000 cuts, where each of these shows and a lot of the images that are presented by itself might be okay. But imagine a child who is watching a lot of this programming consistently without parental guidance. But hey, moving on, because the Wild Thornberrys dropped in 1998. And before I go any further, I need to point out that the Wild Thornberrys was technically supposed to be an adult animated sitcom. They just did some product testing and realized that it was going to work better with the kid market, so that's exactly where they took it. Eliza is the main character, and the show revolves on her ability to talk to animals. Now, she's not born with this ability. It comes from a shaman. Again, if you're someone coming from a Christian context, they're introducing these ideas, these imagery of, like the magical power that comes from this shaman that gives her the ability to talk to animals. I'm not saying that you can't watch the show and that it might not be okay in theory, but if, again, imagine a child watching this without any parental guidance. Again, this imagery, these ideas being floated. If you just look at the characters, there's a talking monkey. And granted, the monkey talks to Eliza because she can talk to the animals. But the monkey's name is Darwin. If you know anything about the theory of evolution, Charles Darwin, they made the monkey named Darwin. That's not a big leap. And then you end up with Donnie, who's the adopted, boy to the family. He was raised by orangutans. So it's kind of like some Tarzan type of energy. So he's always, babbling and talking all type of crazy. It feels like you're almost giving us like the evolved monkey and then the caveman boy character. Like that's kind of what you're giving us just between those two. Again, Eliza's the one that, talking to the animals. And then you move on to Eliza's parents who are, filmmakers doing these, like National Geographic style documentaries and traveling. And that's kind of, the premise for the show and how she's engaged, Eliza specifically, is engaging with all these animals. So they're more concerned with that, which is why she's off on the deep end, involved with the animals and dealing with the hippos and the lions and everything else. Snakes, like all of that is represented. I'm not even really dealing with the humor itself. Remember, this is an adult animated cartoon that got brought down to the level of kids. So I don't even need to explain much what the type of jokes that might show up, considering what would slip through the cracks when you try to peel back the layers on what the show actually is. And if you actually saw the show, then you should remember there's one more character that I conveniently left out until this moment. Debbie is Eliza's sister. Now, she's supposed to be a normal teenager. She wants to, be in, normal society, hang out, go to concerts, listen to rock music. She had ripped jeans and things like that. Like, okay, that is what it is. Because you have this, like opposite character to Eliza who's all about the nature and all about being with the animals, quite literally. But just look at the artwork that is Debbie Thornberry. You have a young lady, teenager, who's portrayed with a midriff, and clearly, she has a very sizable chest that protrudes out, for lack of a better term. It might be a cartoon, but why are we doing this? Again, imagine 6, 7, 8 years old, maybe 9. Why is this the image that we need to keep giving them? Somebody had it in their minds. Because remember, this is a cartoon. You could have drew that character any way you wanted. They chose to draw that character that particular way. According to my research, there was apparently an unaired episode where Eliza and the monkey, Darwin, that's her, monkey pet or what have you, that there was some form of a romantic thing going on between them and they develop or get into some form of relationship. Again, it was an unaired episode that pointed towards, I'm not going to go down that path, but you get the idea about the type of idea, the type of thing they were trying to express or that might have been portrayed to the kids if that episode did go to air. You can see why it didn't. But the writers made it. So that means they're pointing in that direction before the episode drops, because that's just how you do it. But imagine binge watching this show repeatedly with no parental guidance. And after everything I just said, I am aware that there's one show that I cannot end this video without giving it just due. So it's time for us to address the Spongebob Squarepants situation. The show dropped in 1999, It ran for like 16 seasons making new episodes. It's the giant of a cartoon that Nickelodeon came up with. I don't think they ever expected SpongeBob would be this big a phenomenon because it ran out of the 90s, through the 2000s, and then into the 2010s. SpongeBob Squarepants is a big deal. Now, this is not intended to be a history lesson. I'm actually focusing on the imagery. But SpongeBob Squarepants wasn't even supposed to be his original name. It was supposed to be SpongeBoy. And apparently that thing was incorporated or was taken in some form, so they ended up coming up with SpongeBob Squarepants. I'm just going to throw this out there. His name is Spongebob Squarepants. That's his name. And he lives in Bikini Bottom. Think about that. Remember, if you're an adult out there. And after that, we find out that he has a friend named Sandy Cheeks. Once again, if you're an adult, you can figure this one out. And he works with, what's the name of the guy? At the restaurant? Mr. Krabs. Sexual innuendo, my friends. SpongeBob Squarepants. So I don't have to break down too much. That adult humor, all of that is going to show up in SpongeBob Squarepants. Honestly, SpongeBob Squarepants the show, it's almost like hitting the jackpot on everything they've been trying to do with these other characters. It all started back with Ren and Stimpy, Rocko's Modern Life, which I'm going to flag Rocko for this reason, because although both of those shows had the adult humor, dark humor, satire, violence, all of that in there, targeted towards kids as basically adult animated shows that were retooled for the kid market. Rocko's Modern Life had a writer who became incredibly central to SpongeBob. It just is what it is. So there's a clear carryover with that energy. The difference is that SpongeBob Squarepants becomes non-threatening. They made the character himself incredibly naive. So as a result, it makes him, cute, makes him cuddly. It makes it way easier to sell this product to the young child market and to make it passable to parents. So I think SpongeBob sends this, this image of safety and fun and lightheartedness. That's more or less the taste that people had in their mouths after watching a SpongeBob SquarePants episode. But there's still a lot of adult content as far as, the satire, the jokes, the innuendo, all of that is in there. It's just under a layer that makes it harder to just initially see. And I've always wondered how they even came up with the concept of SpongeBob SquarePants anyway. They were trying to develop something that was the weirdest sea creature they could ever come up with, and they just moved towards this idea of a talking sponge. Went from a sea creature all the way down to a talking sponge. Hey, it is what it is. Now, there's always been some form of controversy around SpongeBob SquarePants. Always. And some of that has, been related to, I guess the term sexuality would apply and so on. Now, coming from somebody who has Christian values, is rooted in that faith. Where I stand isn't all that important. Let's just deal with the facts. SpongeBob SquarePants in Season 2 had an episode where him and Patrick, who was supposed to be his friend, like a very close friend in the show, they are adopting and raising a baby clam together. And when they do, SpongeBob is doing so under the role of the mother and Patrick as the father. Now, his name is SpongeBob. That's the name. And I said he because I think everybody else agrees that when you see Bob, you assume a particular gender. Where you stand on these issues is not what I'm here to talk about. Let's just deal with the facts. Emphasis on Bob and Patrick in Season 2 are raising a clam together. And you can understand why this episode was considered controversial even when it dropped. And Steven Hillenburg, I believe he's, one of the, the primary, creators of the show. He gave a defense saying that, a sponge is neither male or female. That was supposed to refute the idea that this type of relationship was a same gender, situation or what have you. That was his thought process. But again, regardless of where you stand on the issues, let's just look at the facts one more time. When questioned about whether or not SpongeBob and Patrick are in a relationship that goes against what people understand to be, male-female dynamics. Again, just dealing with the facts. The response given by the creator of the show was that SpongeBob is neither male or female. Considering we are in the year 2025, whichever way you land on that, it's still pretty clear what idea they're trying to express. Let's just assume that the creator is 100% on base. He's neither male nor female, so it's not a he. It's a they. If that's the case, we're still introducing these ideas to the children. Now, you can do it. I'm not here to tell people what they can and cannot do. But parents, if they're not in the room, don't really know what the kid is watching. These ideas are traveling and they're circulating forward. I've already addressed the innuendo. Some of it is baked into the names. If it's baked into the names of the characters, obviously those jokes are going to circulate at different points in the show. Other popular controversies for SpongeBob, which I think become controversies because the show is just so wildly popular. They did an episode where they were essentially making fun of cursing, which the thought process that it kind of, trivializes it, makes it seem that for young children that cursing is okay, it's something to laugh at, it's something funny. So, hey, there's that part. I remember that episode pretty vividly. And then you have the other concept where they make some, satirical jokes about society. One episode where they were kind of making fun of the food stamps program and things like that, apparently. So depending on how you feel about that, that can, send a particular message to young people about how they should feel about, those who are in poverty. At the end of the day, SpongeBob was a big hit. It was probably the biggest hit that Nickelodeon ever had. You could call it a grand slam if you want. And SpongeBob is 1999. Like, it helped launch them into the 2000s. Because I could have tacked SpongeBob onto 2000, real fine if I did it on another video. But because he drops in 1999, SpongeBob, whatever. Because SpongeBob drops at that time, it puts us in a position where now you can see where the 2000s are going to go. Nickelodeon in the 90s is not exactly what I remembered. I watched the shows. I enjoyed most of them, or at least I thought I did. But when I went back to watch them as an adult, they don't hit the same. Nickelodeon in the early 2000s was a very big deal because by that point, they were probably the biggest giant in all of kids' TV media. Disney Channel wasn't anywhere near as big as it was about to become. Cartoon Network, I think it's fair to say, had lost to Nickelodeon on popularity. I'm not here to come up with this crazy conspiracy theory that Nickelodeon was out there to just, stick it to the kids. That's not the point. What I am saying is that they were following profits above all else. And some of the writers did know exactly what they were doing when they were adjusting, shifting, and crafting these shows. Remember, this is television. These shows don't just pop out of nowhere. They have writers who are adults who build every single component in. Remember, Nickelodeon was doing all of this, running their network with the attitude that parents really don't know what their kids are watching. So just think about what might show up in a show if that is how you're running your business. But hey, I guess it's up to the parents to figure it out. And if they're not in the room, well, let the chips fall where they fall. So let's talk about it. The 90s was wild, and it's what built Nickelodeon. But when you get to the 2000s, I'm going to call this, at least this first half of the 2000s, kind of break it up into 4 categories. I'm going to walk through the shows with some semblance of, timeline order, but I'm also going to break them up into categories just in the interest of time. And the first category I have to address is what I call the unicorn. There's only one. The unicorn that they had for the 2000 era is the Amanda Show, because it actually starts in 1999 and rolls into 2000, and for the time it was on, it was the most watched live action show that Nickelodeon actually had. Keep in mind, all that is still on the air. Amanda Bynes started on all that. She launches into, her own show. They make a sketch comedy around her. They have little, skits like, Moody's Point and Block Blister and The Girls' Room. I remember that because, I remember them. I actually remember the show. I remember it well enough. And even, Drake Bell, Josh Peck, I think that's probably when people were truly, introduced to both of them. So without the Amanda Show and, kind of what it does for the 2000s, you probably don't get Drake and Josh later, which I ain't talking about in this video, but it's coming in the next one. Everything that kind of offshoots from it, because there would be no, iCarly if we never saw Miranda Cosgrove show up on Drake and Josh. This is a huge deal. But the Amanda Show is pretty wild. It keeps a lot of all that energy, but it's a sketch comedy show. It's just kind of over the top. It's not necessarily a show that had a whole bunch of crazy undertones. Yes, there's some sexual innuendo, like a scene where, they're talking about, you gave me crabs. That was the punchline of a joke, things like that. But fundamentally, it's just over the top comedy. Nothing really, too crazy in terms of if you were actually to follow it, line for line. But you don't have any parental influence whatsoever. It's just, characters doing a bunch of wildness in the name of entertainment. And because there really wasn't anything like it in the live action column on Nickelodeon at that time, you could count all that, but this is a spinoff before we got to real sitcoms that were, consistently being pumped out. Because there's other things happening. And the real reason why the Amanda Show is a unicorn is not just because it was live action and successful. There were other live action shows. They just weren't that successful. I'm going to throw some names out you probably don't even remember. Brothers Garcia, 100 Deeds for Eddie McDowd. That's a thing. These shows existed and you can go dig them up. But good luck out there trying to find evidence that they really happened, aside from what, bare minimum you can find on Google. The Amanda Show was a little interesting in the fact that it just abruptly stopped. It was very successful and then it stopped. Now, we've come to find out years later, there was a lot of controversy off the camera. And because of all those things, Quiet on Set gets into some of it, the show just kind of disappeared. But Amanda Bynes goes on to be a star does some other movies, moved away from even Nickelodeon, and there you have it, The Amanda Show. But there's only one unicorn, so what else happened? Because after that, you have the show that I call The Forgotten. And most of this really relates to the dawn of Teen Nick. Because Nickelodeon was trying to figure out who they were and who they weren't in the early 2000s. So they were trying to figure out what can they do with the teen market, because they were like, hey, some of our demographic is aging. Now, going to show for show, you had shows like As Told by Ginger, which launched in 2000. You had My Life as a Teenage Robot, which is 2002. Then you had All Grown Up in 2003. I'm going to just go through all of them real quick. But As Told by Ginger, by the time that one pops off, they're trying to move squarely into the teen market. You have a character who is, the daughter of a single mother who's divorced. We see her dad a little bit in the context of the plot. She had a brother who's a little off the beaten path. He even entered the weird kid competition or a weird human competition. Like, the only scene I remember was him outside in the snow, essentially naked aside from underwear in a cartoon, rolling around in the snow because he had put lard on his body to keep him warm. Again, these are the type of things we saw in the plot. Ginger has friends. Her friends are on the, not popular side of, I guess, middle to high school. It's like middle high school age, I guess. So like it's teen, but it's still like on the younger side of teen. And most of the plots kind of revolve around like her kind of walk this line as far as like, am I going to be with the popular kids or can I kind of break in? Then there's the crew who she has. I mean, we see B plots around her brother and him kind of going off the beaten path with a whole bunch of, randomness. He has his friend, with the purple hood. I think they called him Hoodie. Like, I remember watching As Told by Ginger. I even remember the theme song by, I think it was Macy Gray. And the show even attempted to engage deeper themes, like things that would be somewhat related to teenagers, like addiction. I mean, they did that with an episode around caffeine, just to clarify, try to keep it somewhat appropriate for Nickelodeon. And As Told by Ginger even aired on Teen Nick, like when they tried to, do the Teen Nick block before we got the Teen Nick network and eventually changed its name to the end. Like, all of that actually happened. But the show was still pretty tame. Just being real. I mean, the same people did Rugrats, actually did this one, but you don't have the talking baby stick. And when you lose that, it's really not all that special. So I think that's why it kind of only lasted 3 seasons, barely, like it limped into the 3rd season and then got shut down. And remember, Nickelodeon's trying to figure out their footing, because if you know what happened in the 90s, things were pretty wild. But here we are, As Told by Ginger. Because My Life as a Teenage Robot drops in 2002, and for the most part, most people don't even remember that it happened. It's about XJ9, who is a humanoid or a sentient robot. So it's like a robot who has a soul. I guess she goes to high school, as far as I remember. And, she has friends and all of that. I even think there's like something around love interest or something like that. But again, going entirely off head. And she's created by this professor, but she's like somewhat a superhero, but also like a typical teenage girl in the general sense. So a lot of the jokes kind of go around that. Coming back to that show, thinking from the year 2025, it's actually a little wild. Because now we have an AI-generated world where, people even have, AI, companions and so on and so forth. So that's pretty wild when you think about where this show was, having conversations 20 years ago. But My Life as a Teenage Robot didn't do all that well either. It ran for like 2 seasons and basically just kind of flamed out. I think it was like not even barely 40 episodes before it was over. And to be real about it, it never felt like that show to me fit in with Nickelodeon, but they were really in their experimental phase in the early 2000s. So you had, some Cartoon Network folk who came over to work on different things. This was one of those moments. And obviously it failed because the guy who helped to do this went right on back to Cartoon Network shortly thereafter. I think he worked on like Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends for whoever actually watched it. I wasn't in that group, but I'm sure somebody did. Considering that As Told by Ginger was like a teen show that wasn't teen enough, I think that's kind of how people feel about why it didn't work as well. And My Life as a Teenage Robot was a teenage show that wasn't, teen enough in a whole different direction, but a little too off the beaten path. Both of those failed, and then Nickelodeon took another crack at it in 2003 with All Grown Up. They took the Rugrats kids, grew them up to not even really teens, preteens, and tried to make a show around that. Now, because you have the nostalgia hit of characters who people were familiar with, I mean, I've already talked about Rugrats in another video. I mean, the characters are grown up, but they ain't all grown up. And the plots were pretty, I don't want to say basic, but they were just kind of like relevant plots that, a preteen kid might have, because they were like not really even teenagers. They were like more 12, 11, 13, like in that window. But I don't even know if anybody was really 13 except maybe Angelica or like Susie. And when you lose the talking babies bit, which it wasn't just about the talking babies. It was the fact that in Rugrats, you had kids who were, somewhat making satire and, comedy around the world as they were trying to understand what it would like to be an adult, out of the mouth or out of the experience of a baby. Like that's what the show was and why I think it lasted so long. So when they tried to come back to the drum and hit it again with All Grown Up, I mean, it ran for technically 5 seasons, but it never even made it to 60 episodes. You got to remember, we're talking about a Nickelodeon that has SpongeBob Squarepants on the docket, a show that went for 16 seasons. 16 seasons. All the way through the 2000s, into the 2010s, and came out of the 90s. So when I say all of these shows were somewhat failures or, forgettable or like, yeah, they happened, but like nobody's really going back to them like that. That's what I mean. Depending on how you look at it, All Grown Up, because it did more episodes, was more successful. But it was really, as told by Ginger, redone again with characters who you were familiar with and actually watered down even more. Because Nickelodeon clearly, again, is still trying to experiment, like, where is our lane? And those two shows were both, again, not aggressive enough compared to things we saw in the Nickelodeon 90s. Because if you know the Angry Beavers, CatDog, and what those shows actually were, especially once you go back to the Ren and Stimpy era or the Rocko's Modern Life era, this is way watered down compared to what we were seeing at that time. But remember, they're throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks. But before I get to the one show that is clearly the standout hit from this era, I gotta give you the next few that weren't exactly that, but you probably do remember for a whole bunch of different reasons. So in 1999, heading into 2000, doubling all the way back, Nickelodeon did give us Rocket Power. Now, I remember watching that basically when it dropped. Like, I remember the lead up, the commercials, all of that, and then watching episodes air from that point on. Probably saw almost every episode for the most part, because remember, it's the cable era. We didn't have that much choice. Rocket Power give you all of this, X Games vibes with all the extreme sports stuff, skateboarding and inline skating and, street hockey, all of it. You have the two characters, Reggie and Otto, who are brother and sister, or, Reggie is the sister. And then you have their father, Raymundo, that's what they used to call him. But he is a widower. So we've seen divorced parents in other shows, and now we have a widower. I mean, they have a friend named Sam. Sam is from Kansas, but he has the N on his shirt. That's a glitch in production, because the N was supposed to be for New York. Regardless, he is the child of divorced parents, and he stayed with his mom. Then we have another friend named Twister, who he does have parents in the home, a father and a mother, but we don't really see them a whole lot in the plot worked in. Like, it just is what it is. I mean, it really kind of rode on the extreme sports, kind of tip for most of this. I mean, the show was, again, still done by the exact same, production group who were behind Rugrats and then All Grown Up or even As Told by Ginger. So those folk went to work a whole lot in this era. And Rocket Power, I think it lasted pretty long. Like, it had, quite a few seasons that hit from 99 into like 2004-ish or 20, even probably getting closer to 2005. They even did a made-for-TV movie. And you can't forget the character named Tito, who used to run a surf shack alongside, the father of, Reggie and Otto. And he provided what they call like, the philosophical or like, spiritual leadership for the kids. He would give a whole bunch of one-liners about like how they should live and how they should move and address the problems in their lives. I mean, for the most part, Rocket Power was really depending on the extreme sports hit. If he was going to take that show over the edge. I mean, the jokes and things, like, again, yeah, there may be a little bit of innuendo, a little bit of, adult humor or something, but it's nothing too crazy compared to what we saw in the 90s. So it's pretty clear that Nickelodeon toned it down a little bit, probably in response to some of the criticisms. And then in 2002, Nickelodeon tried it with Jimmy Neutron Boy Genius. They actually launched it as a movie first and then did a spin-off show. Now, I remember watching the movie and watching the show. And you would have thought that because of the amount of money it takes to produce a movie, that the show would have been more successful. It only ran for about 3 seasons. So let that sink in. Jimmy Neutron, he's a boy genius. It's kind of baked into the title. He has his friends Carl and Sheen. There's a girl, Cindy. I guess he likes her or something like that. There's a girl, Libby. I mean, I vaguely remember these things from watching the show. But more or less, the plots kind of revolve around, Jimmy's inventions and, something goes wrong with him. And then him and his friends get into, all these types of, crazy situations as they kind of deal with, the aftermath of whatever he created. The jokes and everything, it actually kind of felt like it was actually on brand, like kind of hit the age market or age demographic they were actually trying to go for. It wasn't as much of the adult humor. Like, yes, there were some innuendo and some things like that. Like, a scene where, Jimmy was, in a bathtub. But I mean, it's a cartoon, so they don't over portray what's going on. But like, you see that, I think I remember Sheen was in a shower. I mean, stuff like that. But overall, the show kind of stayed in the pocket of the demographic they said they were going for. And maybe that's the problem, because the show didn't last all that long. Remember, in the 90s, Nickelodeon pushed the envelope a whole lot. The 2 most interesting things I noticed about that show was, 1, the fact that Jimmy Neutron is a boy genius, but he's still going to school with regular kids. Don't really see how that works, because if he's a science genius, he probably should be in college or something like that. But hey, it is what it is. And the other half was how they dealt with the parents. Because this is the first time, if you've been clocking, aside from All Grown Up, that I've mentioned in this video, where we actually have a character who has 2 parents. That's the first time I'm mentioning it. And his parents are Not my words. Common Sense Media said it. They called them typical spacey parents. Spacey, that's the word. Kind of like, parents who have been dumbed down, not really offering any value, no real parenting. Like, that is how they clarify it. Doesn't mean that they don't have any scenes where the parents don't do something. But it's, again, severely watered down in the context of Jimmy Neutron. But perhaps the most aggressive show that Nickelodeon came out with in this window has to be Danny Phantom. It dropped in 2003, didn't last all that long. It's another one of those shows that kind of feels a little bit off-brand. You had some Cartoon Network energy involved with it. But hey, it is what it is. Because Danny Phantom is a boy who becomes part ghost. Similar to how Spider-Man became Spider-Man, but, this time it's a ghost. He has friends Tucker and Samantha. Samantha is like a gothic, girl. Like, that's how she's dressed and how she's portrayed. But she comes from a conservative home, conservatively Jewish, actually. But, she's obviously living on a very different, different path. And even with Danny Phantom, who, he has some ghosts who are allies, who he works with. Then there are the evil ghosts who he's, going after. So you have ghosts who are kind of going both directions, apparently, including him. Like, the plot actually even builds in this component where his parents are, ghost hunters, not ghostbusters, but ghost hunters. And they want to, dispel or catch all the ghosts, which means that they, kind of sense that there's ghost energy in the home because of their son, but they're trying to figure it all out. So, hey, this was a representation. And if you're coming from a Christian context, you can already see the problems. The show is classified as comedy horror. If you go look it up, that's one of the classifications of the show. So they are trying to scare the kids to some degree. And I actually watched it because even though I wasn't supposed to, it was on Nickelodeon. I didn't have a whole lot of choices. And if parents weren't in the room, I just watched what I saw. So Danny Phantom, definitely represents Nickelodeon pushing the needle or pushing the envelope, especially when it comes to, portrayals, especially the whole concept of the parents disagreeing with this component of their son who is, something that's central to him. You can kind of interpret that how you want to, especially in the context of where our culture is today, like in America. But ultimately, the show didn't work all that well. I mean, it developed a cult following from those people who, kind of like this direction. But it probably was like a little bit too over the edge to kind of have mass appeal. But Nickelodeon tried it. Danny Phantom. That actually happened. Which brings me now to a show which you cannot say you watched Nickelodeon in the early 2000s if you don't remember it. The Fairly OddParents. Because in 2001, that thing dropped. It ran for 10 seasons. Ran for like 5 seasons, took a little break, and then came back. They had a live-action movie. They did a crossover with Jimmy Neutron. Like, The Fairly OddParents was a big deal. And this is one of those moments where now I have to talk about why. Because the show was unique, and I think it hit on all of these, crazy points. It had enough of that 90s Nickelodeon energy, but does it in a brand new way. Figured out how to give you cute and cuddly feeling characters in order to move the needle to where we're at. Timmy Turner is the main character. I do remember that. I mean, what was that? Designer did the song with Timmy Turner. Said it in the song. I'm sure it had some deeper, meaning. But hey, Timmy Turner has parents, but his parents really aren't doing any parenting. That's important. They build that into the show. Again, space cadet parents, they're kind of useless in the grand scheme of everything. These fairy godparents, that's what they are. And they essentially are like his real parents or actively, in his life. And they're granting him his wishes. And most of the time they grant him a wish. What ends up happening is it doesn't go exactly the way he had hoped. And the plot kind of, follows off that direction. But yeah, he has friends and a whole bunch of other stuff that happens. But it primarily revolves over the whole show aims around Timmy Turner with these fairy godparents who are giving him these magical wishes, and we kind of watch how it all plays out. Now, if you're coming from a Christian seat, then you can kind of see what's wrong with this. Anytime you bring up, magic and the powers and, kind of where did that come from and so on. But yes, somebody could interpret this as, cute or, safe enough. That's fine. But something else parents should have been aware of is that in this show specifically, there is a lot of cross-dressing. It just is what it is. At least 10, 11, 12 occasions. I think it's like 12 to 13 occasions where you could argue that there were, clear moments of cross-dressing involving the main character, as well as, additional ones, just if you focus on the godparent specifically, Cosmo, who is the male godparent, he, Cosmo, his situation, he's another space cadet, so they represent the man as kind of, dim-witted compared to, Wanda, who is the, woman, godparent. They even had an episode where they did like a gender swap, with Timmy's character, and, I think the godparents and some other stuff happened. They had an episode where the father was dressed up, in a dress as well. Like, they were pretty consistent on the cross-dressing narrative. And just to keep this in perspective, all the way back in the 90s, we had a Nickelodeon executive who went on record to say that he didn't want to have cross-dressing represented in shows or specifically he was working on the Angry Beavers at the time because he didn't want to confuse the kids. But he must not be the executive working on this show, because they definitely did it over and over and over again. It wasn't like a random thing that happened once in a plot. And notice, I'm not even talking about the non-binary character that they built into the reboot version of the show. I'm just focusing on the older version that you would have found in the early 2000s. But the Fairly OddParents was a big hit. So now you have SpongeBob on the boards, because they got that one out of the late 90s into the 2000s. And now you have the Fairly OddParents. Those are your two hits. Anything else that had success either washed itself out accidentally, like the Amanda Show, for controversies and things that were even more off-camera than anything else, or the shows just weren't all that successful. And all the ones that weren't all that successful were the more tame shows. It just is what it is. Either that or they went too far in one direction with a show like Danny Phantom. And to this moment, you have barely any representation of two-parent homes throughout all of these shows that I've mentioned. You've got sketch comedy shows where you don't really need parents at all, at least not in any real context. Then you've got, single parents represented multiple times. All Grown Up is repeating characters, so you kind of have to keep the parents there. And the show is relatively tame, and yeah, it had some nostalgia hit to keep it going. But at the end of the day, nobody thinks about All Grown Up. We think about Rugrats. And you even have Nickelodeon experimenting with just how to hit the teenage market, because they were trying to, kind of play both sides and kind of, keep their audience with them a little bit longer. The ones who were watching in the 90s, kind of moving into the 2000s. At the end of the day, I'd call this the experimental era for Nickelodeon. Because they had the 90s where they built their way up, but they definitely had to go off the beaten path in order to figure it out. And they took some criticism in the media. Remember, not my words, check Common Sense Media and so on. There was criticism, but they did get some hits that emerged. And on the back half of it, they were figuring some things out in order to establish what was going to work going forward. Because once they got it down to a formula, and most of that formula, they decided to move to live action. That is where they stayed. And that is the Nickelodeon that I remember the most. The back half of the 2000s. For the back half of the 2000s, because this is what I'm going to focus on. Remember, it was banger after banger after banger. But you're going to notice that Nickelodeon 100% chose profits over parents. And I'm really not making that part up. So going forward, I am going to break down the biggest shows that Nickelodeon dropped in the back half of the 2000s. However, when it comes to this era, like 2004 on down, it's all about live action, except for one unicorn. And that's where I'm going to start. Avatar: The Last Airbender, which dropped in 2005. This one isn't just a unicorn, and it ain't even just a banger. This is striking gold, like hitting the lottery, when this show actually hit. Because what these writers pulled off is a show that finally dignified children, but still hit them in the right zone. In the first episode, skipping over a whole bunch of stuff because I don't want to waste your time, you can go back and watch the show. At the end of the first episode, or really the first two-part special, because I remember watching that live, like watching it, sitting in front of an actual television, back in the cable era, when you had to watch things when it actually came on. And but on the last lines of that episode, when his friend Katara, along with Sokka, but Katara specifically asked him, Aang, when we first met you, after everything that just happened with the Fire Nation trying to come capture you and so on, like, why didn't you just tell us you were the Avatar? And his response was, because I never wanted to be. That told me this show was headed somewhere. Every major character in the show actually develops. And they even figure out how to take characters who we start off hating, maybe not all of them, but some of them, and make us feel something for them as we go. Zuko, Uncle Iroh, and even Azula of the Fire Nation. When it comes to lessons from Avatar: The Last Airbender and so on, like, again, this is the unicorn of this era. Because on TV ratings, show did lights out. You go on IMDb, it has more, reviews than anything else you're really going to find on Nickelodeon, as far as I can tell. Very high-level reviews, like, very beloved. The show spawned spinoffs, Avatar: Legend of Korra, which I ain't really getting into. Like, we had live-action movie, which failed. Then you had the Netflix live-action show, which is supposed to come back. And when you get to the core of it, even though the show is exactly that, a cartoon, there's real discussion that could actually be had about the world, people, relationships, how they work, how they function. And it does feel like there's an actual moral compass. So even coming from a Christian perspective, where you can actually see a lot of carryovers to the gospel, which I'm not going to get into right now, but I definitely will at some other point in another video, because there's a lot of carryover if you actually know what the gospel says. But fundamentally, Avatar: The Last Airbender isn't just a banger. It is everything that Nickelodeon would probably should have been doing all the time, because Nickelodeon tries to be adult in different points with their kids' shows. But in the 90s, they were just experimenting, throwing a whole bunch of stuff at the wall to see what stuck. And on a network that had Spongebob Squarepants, The Avatar The Last Airbender wasn't just like a change of pace. It was like a whole new demographic that they could tap into and hold on to because they had this show. But that is the last show like it that I've ever seen on the network, unless I missed something. And now is the moment where we hop into all the live action shows that really hit in the back half of the 2000s. Full disclosure, I'm not going to go Victorious because that show drops in 2010. So technically, it's not before 2010, so it doesn't make the cut. But hey, shout out to, Victoria Justice because she got her start on another show, which you know which one I'm talking about. I'm going to get to it in a moment. However, the other show I'm just not going to mention is The Naked Brothers Band. I believe that dropped in 2007, but only ran for 41 episodes, and it really wasn't all that popular. There's a whole bunch of things we could say about it, but I don't really see the point because not enough people watched it. I'm only going to cover one other show that has a similar episode run, but it's just way more important, and it actually happened a little bit more to the core of what was going on at this era of Nickelodeon. But yes, Drake and Josh dropped in 2004, and when it did, you should already see the carryovers for what Drake and Josh became, because you took Josh Peck and Drake Bell and spun them off of The Amanda Show, which is basically a spinoff of all that. It was a sketch show that was spun off of a sketch show. And now we gave them their own program, the same way they did with Kenan and Kel. So in case you didn't know, Drake and Josh is just Kenan and Kel rebooted. Rebooted with those two instead of Kenan and Kel. As for the show itself, the show was pretty good. It was funny. And I would even argue that it has a more special place in my heart just because I was more alert to understand what was actually happening. But the show revolved around them as stepbrothers. Their parents get married, so now they are stepbrothers. They have a little sister, played by Miranda Cosgrove, who, yes, she's coming later when she spins off to iCarly. And unlike the little sister in Kenan and Kel, Miranda Cosgrove plays Megan, who actually has real plots that play out over the course of Drake and Josh. But that's not the point. What matters most is that Drake and Josh is carrying the trend forward, where remember I said profits over parents? Well, the parents in Drake and Josh don't really do much parenting. Just being real about it. Everything between Drake and Josh, like their plots, kind of carry as if their parents aren't really having any real impact. There are times when they show that they kind of care about their parents, but like I said, kind of care. Like even have a moment, like a plot that's incredibly far-fetched, where Drake ends up marrying a girl from Udonia. And he does this without any parental, influence. Because in America, you can't just get married without, like a legal marriage, without your parents actually signing off if you're under 18. So I guess maybe he's over 18, but he's still in high school for the purposes of the show. Who knows? We're not getting into weeds about that. But the parents, like I said, if you dumb the parents down, we can take the plot a whole bunch of places. Remember, Megan gets away with a whole bunch of foolishness that wouldn't happen in a real house with parents who are actually doing things. When it comes to Drake and Josh itself, the show is funny. It was intended to be. There's a lot of memorable moments. Hug me, brother. All of that stuff. I mean, I think season 1 kind of kicks off well enough to kind of bring us in. But if you actually go back and watch, you'll notice some ideas in Drake and Josh that, in the name of comedy, they definitely push the limits beyond what most parents might be comfortable with. Even in season 1, I'm pretty sure that's where it was. Josh starts an advice column and calls it Miss Nancy. And he even puts on a wig and a dress and wears it on camera. Now, clearly that's some commentary about some part of him that, feels like a woman. They don't stay on this in other episodes. But they tried it, and they tried it early, if you see where I'm going with this. And then, later on, we do get another episode where Josh's character, this is while he's working at the premiere, so this is, in a different season. He's real excited. Somebody's walking by, a person who we think is a woman. He grabs this person, gives them a kiss, and then the person announces that they are not a woman. That is the joke. So, yes, these moments happen, but that's really not dominating the entire show. But it's in there. Just to clarify, those things are in there. But Drake and Josh carried forward this trope of spacey parents in Nickelodeon shows, does it in live action, and this was probably one of the last moments where they even tried that hard with the parent. Because aside from this, there's only one other show to talk about. Nickelodeon basically just got rid of parents. They figured out that, the plot, we could just do whatever the heck we want if we just get the parents all the way out the show. And that's exactly what they did. The only other time that we saw parents show up in a Nickelodeon program that you might remember from this era is Unfabulous. It starred Emma Roberts as the main character, Addie Singer. She has her two friends, Gina and Zach. To clarify, we never see Gina's parents. I don't believe we ever see Zach's parents either on camera for the entire life of the show. And it only ran for 41 episodes. But you have to understand what was going on in this window to see why Unfabulous belongs on the list. Now, Addie does have, parents. In the first episode, I believe, more or less one of the pilots of this show is called The Party. So her parents are there, and they actually are seemingly trying to parent. But I guess some people would classify this as gentle parenting, because as a result, they let Addie have a party in the house. They remove themselves. They say, we'll go upstairs and let you party. We won't be present. They try to, I guess, use a webcam or something to spy on the party, but we will not physically be there. Addie tells them, like, oh, there's going to be kissing in the party and so on. And they're like, oh, we're fine with that. So you see how it's like this idea of like the parents kind of giving a lot more permission. Like they're parenting, but they're giving a lot more permission than what we would normally see in a kid's show. Again, normally they just make the parents idiots. Here they didn't go that far. They just kind of weakened like the presence of what they do as parents. And remember, the other kids, their parents, we just don't see them. The plots of the show are kind of interesting where, it's like the show is trying to take itself more seriously than almost anything else that I'm going to mention in this window of Nickelodeon, again, amongst the live action shows. So there are some life lessons, and see the characters trying, learn about, okay, the impact of lying, or, kind of, what does it mean to be a good person and how to relate. But one thing that stood out to me, because this isn't the last time they did it, but maybe it's one of the first times I really noticed it. When Addie is in school, which she does spend quite a few moments in the plot in school, a lot of it revolved around two things. So the primary is she is always interested in relationships, or that's a core tenet of the plot. Season 1 is almost just Addie chasing after this guy named Jake Bahari. Like, so much so she's even making songs about him, playing the songs on her guitar. I mean, I don't know if Emma Roberts really couldn't sing, but she certainly played a character who couldn't sing hardly at all. And she even have a whole episode that's dedicated to her having written 66 songs about this young man, put them on a CD. I don't know how a CD holds that many songs, but hey, it is what it is. And, she's afraid that he might hear the CD with all these, love songs that essentially represent her almost like a stalker. But that's a large tenet of the plot. I mean, her friends are there, but they're kind of like, I kind of view them as accessories to Addie's life, because Addie is the only person who we get a family. Like her parents, her brother. She's kind of living in her brother's shadow. Like, the show takes itself seriously, but then I compare it to, A Boy Meets World, which isn't a Nickelodeon show. And yeah, that came in years prior. But that show also takes itself seriously, but just does it very differently. They lean all the way in the family. They start leaning into the families of the other characters. There's this sense of trying to pilot through. So like, Addie is almost like a female Boy Meets World, just done nowhere near as well. That is how I see it. And yeah, they do portray some things about, her and her school. Specifically, they make the principal the butt of the joke all the time, where she's just this mean and surly principal who just doesn't connect to the students, which I don't necessarily think is the most beneficial portrayal, because in a Boy Meets World context, the teachers are actual valuable characters in the show. But hey, that's just me talking, because Unfabulous didn't really hit that long. It only ran for 41 episodes because maybe it took itself too seriously. And Nickelodeon learned that lesson and corrected it, and everything else they did in this era that actually did hit. Because during the exact same year, Ned's Declassified School Survival Guide came out in 2004. And that show is one that I thought I liked a whole lot when I was a child. Going back to watch it, because I watched all of Season 1, all of Season 3, and parts of Season 2. And that's all within the last year or two. So it's still pretty fresh. It doesn't have the same place in my heart now that it once did. And a lot of it comes down to me realizing that when it comes to killing off the parent, maybe Ned's Declassified School Survival Guide was probably the biggest opportunity that Nickelodeon took to actually do it. Again, emphasis on the biggest. We never, as far as I know, see a parent represented for any of the characters in this show. The entire thing occurs in Polk Middle School. Every scene occurs there. And the only adults we see are affiliated with the school. To keep it a buck with you, every adult represented in the context of the school, whether it was Vice Principal Krubbs, the teachers that they had, anybody else, for the most part except for one, Mr. Wright, I remember him, and it's even baked into the title. Mr. Wright. All of them are basically off their rocker in some form. Doesn't mean they don't offer some decent value at some point here and there. But the characters portray the teachers just kind of as weirdos. They even have a teacher called I-Teacher, who doesn't come to school and she's afraid, to leave her home, and she even makes jokes about it, in the context of the plot. So they put the parents and the adults on that shelf. So now we have a world of children just kind of popping off, doing a bunch of randomness and trying to figure out the world, but they're doing it all by themselves. Again, no parental guidance, because we don't need parents anymore. That's why we killed them out of the plot. Ned is the main character. He has his friends Cookie and Mose. We represent their friendship. Everything kind of angles towards, if you weren't paying attention, from early all the way down to you get to season 3, because it did 3 seasons, 55 episodes or so. By the time you get to the end, Ned and Mose actually develop a relationship, a dating relationship. So kind of made sense that the boy and girl who were friends were eventually going to make it down that path. And they point that direction, but a whole bunch of stuff happens along the way where Yes, love, dating, relationships is a very central plot tenet at that point. A bunch of other stuff happens, and they find a bunch of different ways to introduce comedy, but they keep pointing in that direction. But now, here's where we get to the thing parents might want to know. Cross-dressing is a pretty big deal in the Declassified School Survival Guide. They did it in the name of comedy, but they did it a whole lot. Off-head, I remember Cookie and Ned dressing up as women multiple times. Cookie did it so much so where you actually get used to it. Remember one time he did it because he wanted to get into a girls-only book club. Another time he did it because he was trying to, get to know Lisa Zemo or something like that to learn what she likes. So because there's a girl he likes and he wants to get to know her, his thought process was dress up like a girl to get to know her. How that works, I don't know. But it is what it is. There's a lot of, troubling imagery that played into this show. Again, it was consistent. Even go back to, earlier parts of the show where, again, parents might want to know this part. It's the best way I could put it, where they introduce a life science class where, Ned and Cookie end up raising a baby together for the purposes of the show or purposes of the class. And they even refer to them jokingly as the alternative family because there were no other, boy-girl pairs that they could put together. And that is a running plot that doesn't just last in one episode. Like, it carries into multiple episodes. So they're not just throwing this stuff at the wall. These ideas actually sit. As a child, when you're watching this, you're getting accustomed to seeing this imagery. I'm not saying that you can't have these conversations, but it's hard to have a conversation when the parents aren't in the room, which is what Nickelodeon assumed when they made most of these shows. Depending on how you feel about it, some of the nostalgia hit of Ned's Declassified did wear off a little bit when the Ned's podcast came out. And although the podcast does provide valuable insight on the characters, or specifically the lives of the actors as they're playing the characters, I think the other side of that coin is that perhaps they did overshare a little bit, and there's been some chatter online about that, which does kind of ruin some of the illusion. Because if you think back to Drake and Josh, which is a part of the Dan Schneider era, and there's other shows that are also in that era that we're talking about now, which, Quiet on Set addresses a lot of that. Like, even Drake Bell said himself that he doesn't want to let the specter of things that happened off camera affect how people receive what happened on camera. I think that's a very interesting point to consider because the show lives on. It does. And Ned's Declassified is one of those that push the envelope a lot in the name of comedy. But sometimes when they use a joke, a specific type of joke, and then use it over and over and over again, it has to beg the question, why? Because they tried it. Yet only 1 year after this, in 2005, was the show that probably means the most to me on this list. Because Zoey 101 dropped. Jamie Lynn Spears was the main character playing, and the show revolved around the Zoey and Chase, relationship, will they, won't they? That's how some people frame it. But at the end of the day, Zoey 101 wasn't just a show. They gave us a world that brought us in. Because at the end of the day, a whole bunch of young folk, myself included, wanted to go to Pacific Coast Academy, even though it wasn't even a real school. The show revolved around this boarding school, and again, remember I said, kill off the parents. So the only time I remember seeing a parent, the only time I remember it, are as follows. In the first episode, Zoe's father only, drops her and Dustin off at the school. Dustin is her little brother. And after that, the only other time I think I saw a parent that wasn't hers was Logan Reese had a parent in another episode. This is down the line in the plot where we see, his dad represented, I think it was almost two different actors. I don't even know if it was the same actor, twice. One where Logan gets his credit card taken away and the dad comes to discipline him. And the other time is, they did like a 2-part special where they did like a Battle of the Sexes episode. That actually happened. But Zoey 101 allows, group of friends, girls and guys to kind of get, kind of the mixture because even though it's called Zoey 101 and we know she is the main character, we get to see the guys a lot in the context of the show. So you have the relationship between them, the friendships between them. There's the only dating relationship between the friends that really, is pointed to for the most part is potentially Zoey and Chase. Then later on, randomly toward the end of the show's run, you get Quinn and Logan who kind of, match up as a thing. The rest of it is a lot of, side plots and, things that are happening in the context of the school. Again, without any parents involved, we see some very interesting representations in terms of how they engage the adults. Just being real. I mean, there was an episode that I remember where they had a new dean of the school and the girls thought the dean was attractive. And somehow there's a plot line that eventually ends up with this dean late at night laying across the laps of these young ladies in their dorm lounge. Now, why a grown man is in a dorm lounge with some teenage girls laying across them, beyond me. Wildly inappropriate and probably could get you, fired if, that played out. Like, the whole situation is wild. But, like, these are the types of things that happen in the plot. But Zoey 101 also pushes the envelope more than most people notice. Remember, I'm just giving you stuff off head. Things that maybe a parent might want to know about if your 10-year-old is watching this show. As early back as season one, they did a school dance where they were supposed to be like a matchup where you would, fill out answers and they give you your perfect match. And everybody got a match, a boy-girl pair, at least in the main character plot, except for Michael, because his character gets matched up with a guy. I remember this, and they play that plot out, where he eventually goes to the dance and has a good time with this guy. Now, it's in the name of comedy, but you see where they're going with this. Because later on, we do get cross-dressing represented in a few different formats. Most people remember, when, some characters moved around, Victoria Justice joins the show. She dresses up as a boy in order to prove that she is no different than the guys. And she moves into a dorm as a boy. Now, how that works, once again, it's wild in the name of plot. But again, they tried it. Boys and girls, there's no difference between them fundamentally. And she's, in cross-dressing her way through that episode, at least all the way till the end. But that's not the end. Logan's wearing a dress because Quinn tricks him into doing it and has to walk through the campus wearing a dress and high heels. There's another episode that's a little bit different where now we have one of Quinn's experiments that go terribly wrong. So now Logan and Michael are running across the campus. They're, naked. They have no clothes on except for they're wearing a trash bag. Like, these images are there, and they might be there in the name of comedy, but they are most certainly there in the show. And then there's some of the inappropriate things that play out that, Quiet on Set, I believe, starts to address a little bit, specifically with uncomfortable for the actors. There's a scene that was kind of more or less a foot fetish scene that played out. Like all of these things are there. So Zoey 101 was a funny show, and it brings us into this interesting world. Kill the parents off, and we can let the plots run. It did take itself more seriously than Ned's Declassified. I think that's one part of it. And then the world that is Pacific Coast Academy is just more engaging than Polk Middle School. No shade, just being honest. Anytime a show gets a reboot, you have to recognize that the original show must be a big deal. And Zoey 101 is one of those moments. I did watch the Zoey 102 reboot. I ain't gonna get into it right now. Maybe I will at some other time. But the one thing I will say that was very interesting to see how they moved the needle on those characters in the reboot. Because if the portrayals of the characters, specifically the men, in that show are any indication of what they were trying to point to in the original, well, it's definitely worth a whole lot more discussion. But hey, we ain't got time for that. Moving on. Because the biggest hit of all the live action shows in this era of Nickelodeon was actually 2007 with iCarly. Because when Miranda Cosgrove left Drake and Josh, got her own program. Again, other shows happened. They even tried to do a spinoff from iCarly. We ain't talking about that. What matters most is this thing runs for 95 episodes. Nobody else on this list that I mentioned even hit 70. Forget about 95. And the first thing I remember about iCarly above all else, because I did watch episodes here and there, but I didn't watch it anywhere near as faithfully as I did Ned's Declassified or Zoey 101 or anything like that. Remember the whole killing off the parents thing? But I just kept it rolling. Because this time we know that Carly has a father. But she doesn't stay with him. She stays with her brother. The plot kind of revolves around that. And her brother Spencer is a space cadet. He offers no real parenting at all. He's actually so immature, it almost feels like Carly is the adult in the relationship. So that happens. And she's a webcam star, again, kind of introducing us to the world of, live streaming and content creation before it really took off to where it became today. So it's almost like prophetic in that sense. And for that matter, maybe it helped to develop a whole generation of content creators. I mean, it's very possible. But again, when you kill off the parents or, portray them negatively, it does something for your plot in the direction of where you can go with things. Skipping over a bunch of details, just focus on the relationships of the characters themselves. We know that her best friends, Carly's best friends, are Freddie and Sam. Both of them have parents, but we really only see one parent represented in any way, shape, or form, and that's the mother. So fathers are now absent. Carly has a father, but we moved him out of the plot for the purposes of argument. And then for the other two characters, their fathers are entirely out of the plot. Just move them away, again, for the purposes of argument. They have mothers, and Sam's mother is portrayed as essentially a very poor mother, not very, caring or, invested in certain things about her daughter, and they kind of make jokes about her, almost as if she struggles with addiction and so on and so forth. So that's that. And on the other end, you have Freddie, who has a mother who's hyper overprotective to the point where, again, he's just trying to break away from her in order to do his own thing. Everything else that happens in the plot is a byproduct of that structure around it. Remember, we just came away from Unfabulous a few years before this, which tried to take itself seriously, at least to some degree. And now, this is the portrayal that we're getting. Yes, iCarly is fun. You have the webcam bits, you have the things that happen in school, You have, the crossover. I think they did an episode where I think Victoria Justice was even a guest character with like, I fight Shelby Marks and so on and so forth. Like the show was fun and engaging and lighthearted and all of that. Like, yeah, that's there. And if they even did a reboot, because when you run that long, makes sense that you would try to do a reboot. They did a real reboot show and tried to run that thing for, I think, 2 seasons or something like that on Paramount Plus. And when it comes to cross-dressing, although it might not be a thing with the main characters, when it comes to Carly's brother, Spencer, there's at least 4 times offhand that I remember where they put him in women's clothing. Just saying. Once again, parents, if you're not in the room, these images are there. And when you keep trying something over and over again, it's hard for me to believe that that's only in the name of comedy at that moment. When it comes to this era of Nickelodeon, which I myself refer to as the Golden Era, Nickelodeon had been experimenting for the 15 years prior about who they really were as a network. And they threw a whole bunch of things at the wall to see what was actually going to stick. And by the time they got to the back half of the 2000s, they really doubled down on live action. Real sitcoms, no longer just a sketch show like All That or The Amanda Show. Because I think maybe they realized that it was easier to kind of, draw out an actual sitcom for the purposes of, running the show. But when they did, they made a decision. And the decision was focus on the lives of the kids, which is understandable. But they always tried to slide it away from the adults. So much so that you eventually got to a point where you just start killing them out of the show. If you can build a world where parents are irrelevant, not only is that not the reality for most kids, but you can now travel and share and express ideas and cook them up in a vacuum because you don't have parental guidance. Coming from somebody who remembered being a kid, but I'm an adult now, and I am a parent, where would children be if we actually didn't have parental guidance? I don't think there's anybody who really believes that kids are better off without good parents who love them and want to help them grow into their best selves. That requires guidance. So when you have a show that takes itself seriously like Unfabulous, there's a reason why, even with parents who are still more watered down, it didn't hit. Because it's being compared to a bunch of other things where parents are either entirely out of the plot or made entirely irrelevant, like iCarly. And when it comes to the plots of the shows themselves, issues of morality are in the center. But where we land on those issues is very unique. Because when it comes to comedy, and that's normally how they tried to introduce it, whether it was Drake and Josh, iCarly, Zoey 101, Ned's Declassified, certain imagery kept showing up over and over and over again. And when you choose to keep doing that, especially if you do it multiple times in a row in the same show, it's hard for me to believe that that joke is just there because you think it's funny. I think you're actually trying to say something with that imagery. And once again, these are conversations that probably should be had. Because Nickelodeon moved away from family television. The 1990s, on other networks, family TV was still a thing. Shows where we expected the parents and the kids would both watch the show. When you move away from that to create a different type of world, fully on the pretense the parents don't know what their kids are watching, not only taking a lot of, but it also can have results that are potentially concerning. Keep in mind, at the end of all of this, Nickelodeon still gave us Avatar: The Last Airbender. That was the banger of all bangers. The show that was a lightning in a bottle. I don't think Nickelodeon could ever remake that show. Because trust me, they tried. That's what Legend of Korra was. It just was nowhere near as good. And the real reason that show stood out, with the reviews and all the notoriety to back it up, because they actually pulled from the real world in order to create a fake one. They didn't try to make the world the way somebody wished it would have been as a writer. It was a cartoon world that they still pulled from reality. Actual historical notes and historical points to build a narrative that was engaging. Because the best stories ever told are already around us in the real world. Even if Nickelodeon can't help themselves from trying to push the envelope, because they think that is exactly what kids want. If you actually made it all the way to the end of this video, I do have to admit that thank you doesn't do it justice anymore, because you are a real one. And if you want more from me beyond this, just realize, there ain't no shame in my game. This is a new channel, so it is always greatly appreciated if you would please like and subscribe.